Welcome, everyone, to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the show where we explore those workplace, workforce, and marketplace trends so that we can understand them and apply them to our own business. And got a local contact today, going to be in the chair across from me here just in a little while. So if you're from any part of the world, you've probably experienced something like what I'm about to suggest that will tie us into today's show. And in my part of the world, here in the Deep South, particularly Mobile, Alabama, which is where the show is recorded, I'll give you three names and tell you then what they have in common. We'll start with the first one, Ankersen, leader in home runs. Second one, you may not be as familiar with, a band that's becoming very popular called the Red Clay Strays. They're out of this part of the world. They opened for the Rolling Stones not long ago. They're selling out in Europe. They're doing quite well. And the third one you've probably heard of, Jimmy Buffett. He's a guy from Mobile, passed away either 18 months, 2 years ago, something like that. But the point is, what do they all have in common? Here's what they have in common. There's no such thing as a local hero. There's no such thing as a local guy done good. In other words, all three of these things, Jimmy Buffett, Ankersen, the Red Clay Strays, have extraordinary success, but in their hometown, they had a hard time catching hold. And it was while they were in their hometown that they were largely overlooked or ignored or just thought that's the local guy. And I can relate to this a little bit, all right? I'm certainly not of the caliber of any of the three people or groups that I mentioned. But the workshops and the seminars that I deliver across the country, I charge a premium for them. They're good. I charge a premium for them. But locally, I can't get anybody to pay anywhere near those prices because, at least in this hometown, in this city here, there seems to be this attitude about local talent, products, quality. It can't be as good. And I remember hearing this. To be an expert, you have to be from out of town. This is anywhere. To be an expert, you have to be from out of town and carry a suitcase or a briefcase. There's no such thing as a local expert. Why is this relevant to today's show? Because of this. I am an absolute nut about the oysters that are grown locally here. Farm-raised, lots of care and attention. The water salinity in the areas around Mobile, Alabama, particularly on the north side of Dauphin Island, in Balabatry, if you're not from around here, find those places on a map, is perfect for creating an absolutely fantastic oyster. And I am a consumer of them. I had a guy named Lane Zerlot on the show several years ago, and he talked to me about this. And that's going to be our subject matter today. When we come back from break, I'll have Doug Ankersen across from me. He runs Isle Dauphine Oyster Company, and he will very clearly tell you the waters around Mobile, Dauphin Island, Baldwin County, Balabatry, Coden, all these places around South Alabama can produce some of the finest oysters in our nation. But strangely enough, the vast majority of them are sold in New Orleans, in Atlanta, in Nashville. No such thing as a local hero. There's no such thing in our community here. Our wonderful South Alabama community here has a hard time recognizing the quality and the uniqueness of our own local oysters. And we're going to have Doug Ankersen on the show. Like I said, when we come back from break, he's going to tell us a little bit about what he does to create this product and specifically this Isle Dauphine oyster product, which has this wonderful salinity to it. I've had a number of them. And then talk about the challenges of getting them to be recognized locally. Why can he sell so many in Nashville and struggle to penetrate the market where people can literally drive to pick up 100 of them at a wholesale price? Anyway, Doug Ankersen coming back from break. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. As always, thanks for listening. We'll be right back.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Again, thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Sitting across from me is Doug Ankersen. He's a mechanical engineer by training, which we'll get into in a moment. But he is the president, the CEO, the boss, the head leader of the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. Sitting with us also is Troy Rosser. He's the director of sales for the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. Gentlemen, before we get into this, thank you both for your time. Welcome to What's Working.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cam.
I'm glad you're both here as an oyster fan, of the product. I love to eat the things, as well as understanding what you've done to create what you have right now. Let's begin telling that story. Doug, you're a mechanical engineer by training. According to your bio, you took some class at Auburn University years ago, and suddenly you were in the oyster business. Tell me a little of that story.
Well, somehow we found out about the oyster training class. Live on Mobile Bay, grew up on Mobile Bay since I was a child with my grandparents and parents. And I was just intrigued to see if we could actually raise oysters in Mobile Bay as a commercial aquaculture, product. Oysters do a lot to clean up the bay, to, create habitat. So it's a real win-win, the initial thought process, but it's a lot of work. And so that's how I got started, taking the class, and then became interested in that. So
that was a long time ago. And today your oysters are for sale, certainly locally, and we'll talk about that, but regionally as well. Before we turned on the mics, I learned that you came back from Nashville last week with a great success and placing your oysters into some fancy Nashville restaurants. When you go in to define your oyster to a chef at a restaurant, how do you describe it? What is the profile of the Isle Dauphine oyster?
It's a salty, sweet tasting oyster with a great clean finish and minerality that takes you back to the place, like Dauphin Island, Mississippi Sound.
What makes those waters so suitable for growing your oysters?
Oysters grow in an ideal condition where the fresh water from the rivers bring the nutrients down, and they mix with the salty waters of the Gulf of Mexico and create a estuary environment where the oysters get their taste, their miroir. That you, when you eat the oyster, that's what you're tasting, is that memoir.
Yeah. And you're a oyster farmer. These are not bottom oysters that they clam, it's not rake, whatever, they tong out of the mud. These are very delicately, that's my word, delicately managed. You delicately manage the conditions of the oyster by raising them and lowering them in the water table. Explain a little bit of that to the listeners.
Okay. So off-bottom oyster farming is what this type of aquaculture is. The oysters are placed in floating cages and in Vexar bags. And as the oysters grow, you manage the density. You allow the oyster room to grow inside the cage. The wave action and how the cage moves with the winds and the tide helps shape and clean the oysters.
Yeah. Troy, when you go in as the director of sales, what are you trying to lead with? How are you trying to get the attention of the buyer?
Well, first we're trying to see what their needs are, what type of customers they're serving, because in the end, we're trying to make sure that we're helping them take care of their customers and we're partnering with them. So we look at their volume to see if they're a fit, what type of customers do they have, because these aren't bottom oysters, as you said. They are off-bottom oysters and therefore a little higher quality. So we really let them know that we want to partner with them and we're going to protect their supply chain and things like that Doug can talk a little bit more about later.
So your pitch isn't, hey, these are great, you should buy a bunch of them. Your pitch is more like, we have a delicious tasting oyster that is going to be predictable for you. We've got a system that if you fall in love with these things, you're going to keep getting them.
That's true, but the part where I don't have to tell them they're great or nobody has to tell them they're great, because we actually take the oysters in and then shuck them and they taste them so they see for themselves that they're really delicious. And, you know, to every chef we've met with, every restaurant that I've been in, everybody has absolutely loved the oysters. And that's really it. We say once we can get them in their mouth, we believe they're going to be sold on them.
Have you had, I hesitate to ask this question, but nobody's ever pushed back and said, these don't taste good enough, they're too salty, they're not salty enough. You've never had any objections?
No, I've never had any.
Yeah. So I recognize that one of the challenges that you have to overcome with your buyer is the predictability of your supply.
Correct.
Because like I said, if they fall in love with them, the last thing they want to hear from you is, I'm sorry, something happened. And as we're recording this show, we've got a hurricane spinning up outside the Yucatan Peninsula. It's going to miss us. We're outside the cone of uncertainty, thankfully. It's going to miss us. What have you done Doug, what have you done to create this predictability such that we could face a Category 3 storm? These restaurants are going to still get their oysters.
We've designed the farm. We've secured the anchoring system so that the cages can withstand hurricane force winds, high tides, things like that. We still can have some damage, to the farm, but it doesn't wipe out the oysters. We've learned how to deal with hurricane situations like Sally and other tropical storms. And
you've been able to, you're resilient to it. Now, one of the things that I understand that makes you unique, Doug, is that you take the oysters from, and forgive my terminology, I don't know it as well as I should, the seed, the baby. You have mother meets father oyster, and you create the baby oysters. You take it from, a Friday night at the bar, two oysters meet one another, to, hey, 14 months later, the babies are being served in Nashville. You control the whole process.
Yeah, we're totally vertically integrated with our hatchery operation. We take brood stock of different types of oysters to create a triploid oyster, which is an oyster that doesn't spawn during the summer months, which is where there's a lot of high demand.
And you have that facility here locally as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you're pairing, when you're creating is the term seed? Is the baby oysters?
The first stage of the baby oysters is larvae.
When you're creating the larvae, it means you pick the oysters that you're trying to pair. Is that right?
That's correct.
What are you looking for when you bring two oysters together in this romantic environment?
You're looking for an oyster that has a certain genetic profile, which Auburn University helps us manage that process and everything.
What is the profile? Can you give me can you elaborate on it? Is it the color of the shell? It's obviously the taste of the meat. Is it the shape? Is there any other components to it?
The shape and the shape of the oyster is one thing, but the genetics of the oyster is another. There's a company that has developed the seedless type oyster, the tetraploid, which is a 4-chromosome oyster, and a diploid, which is a wild oyster. How to spawn those together to create the triploid, which is a non-breeding oyster, which we grow on the farms.
So you get a tetra, a 4, with a bi, a 2, and you create a 3.
That's correct.
They average out. Yeah. So, folks, I guess when you're tasting one of these things, It's not. I was impressed. So I saw they brought me down to the hatchery. Can we call it a hatchery?
Yes.
A hatchery to see the process. There's very little random here. There's very little that's left to chance. When you taste one of these oysters, you're going to find that they're and I'm a fan. I've ordered from Doug before. And I think I'm going to get some from you if I can to take to Tuscaloosa this weekend with my son and his friends. Very little left to chance. What you're tasting is a piece of is both a product of the mechanical engineer's best effort and art perfectly worked together. We'll come back after this break. I'm with Doug Ankersen. I'm with Troy Rosser. We're talking about the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company and the farm-raised oyster business in general. Be right back.
This is Bill Eastet. I perfected my baking recipe behind my live music stage at my little restaurant in Fairhope, Alabama. We have custom-made smokers and small batch bacon made just for you. So if you're looking for the best bacon in America that has been cured, smoked, and even serenaded by songwriters, you definitely need to try Billy's Small Batch Bacon. www.billysbacon.com.
We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. We're talking about oysters, particularly the ones grown here in South Alabama on the north side of Dauphin Island, near Isle Battery in the community of Cote Inn. I'm sitting across from Doug Ankersen. He is the president of the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company, and sitting also with Troy Rosser. He's the director of sales for the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. We talked about, gentlemen, getting attention of these oysters in Nashville. And ironically, it seems like it's easier to get attention for your product in Nashville than it is locally. Tell me about some success stories you've had locally where you've put these things in front of some local chefs and what their reaction has been. And you mentioned to me Poor Baby.
Yes, Cam. We've gone out and we're trying to get the word out. So we're visiting local restaurants and taking them oysters, and like Poor Baby, you mentioned them. We took them a box, and Ricky there, who's a manager, what the plan was to probably try to use them through the weekend on a Thursday, use them Friday, Saturday. And when I went back the following week to talk to him, he said they were gone in one night. People came in here, tasted them, and absolutely loved them.
Yeah.
So that's a typical response that we get as far as once somebody tastes them. I mentioned that earlier. They're sold on them from a flavor perspective.
It's amazing that, and this is something that we've talked about or I've discussed before, and that is in your own hometown, it's hard to stand out. I mean, I'm gonna pat myself on the back here. I've got a pretty doggone good seminar and workshop company, but it's hard to get local business. They look at me and they're like, "Oh, it's just you. We know you. We see you on Saturday morning at the grocery store, and you haven't brushed your teeth and your hair's all over the place and you're wearing two different shoes. You can't be good at anything." And it must be a challenge that you guys can somewhat relate to, Doug, of how do we get this beautiful home product recognized in our own hometown?
Well, one of the things is consistency, following up with the restaurants that maybe tried these oysters 8 to 10 years ago, and there were supply wasn't there. There were openings and closing for one reason or the other. But the companies, the off-bottom oyster farming is difficult, getting the infrastructure in place to be consistent every week and deliver a consistent product. So I think we've over the last 5 to 6 years, as we scaled the business, we've been able to show that and prove that in our core group of customers. We've had some customers that have been with us for over 5 years, some pretty large restaurant groups like the Floribama properties who have supported us and been great partners, in this whole challenge. They're actually bringing touring there. Student chefs, about 35 to 40 chefs, will take a tour of our whole operation either this week or maybe next week, depending on the weather and the storm events.
So tell me, I've had a beer guy on the show one time, and he says there is nothing like, and I'm going to paraphrase him, the Budweiser customer, because that Budweiser customer is loyal to Budweiser. It's typically male, he will only drink Budweiser regardless of where he goes. He's going to order a Budweiser. The craft beer drinker, though, is a pain in the tail, because the craft beer drinker wants to try different craft beers. He goes into the bar and says, I'll try that one, and then I'll choose this other brand and try that one. They're more of a hunter than a loyal consumer. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there's any parallel in the oyster shopper, in the oyster taster, so that he can go trial the Isle Dauphine oyster one week and then say, you know what, that was good, but I next want to try this one over here. Have you seen a shopper behavior out of the oyster consumer? Troy, you recognize what I'm talking about here?
Definitely. You see people that are loyal, or you hear about them. I know when we were in Nashville last week, to your point, we met with the sales team of a distributor up there, and when we were meeting with them, we're talking about their challenges in the market. And one of the things they mention is certain chefs are loyal to oysters from the regions that they come from.
Oh, really? From their home, from their roots?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you had guys that were loyal to northeastern oysters, guys that were loyal to Atlantic oysters, around Virginia and so forth. But it's interesting that when we went in to that point and gave these chefs a sample or samples to taste, we go in their kitchens, open up the oysters, shuck them, and they taste them, and they absolutely love them.
Right. And
I believe to probably about every restaurant we were in last week, these guys saw the difference and the benefits of the product that Doug's growing,
right,
and what that can do for them and their customers and their restaurants.
Doug, what's the most challenging part of creating a consistent flavor profile in these oysters? This stuff that the chefs fall in love with, what's the most challenging part for you on a day in, day out basis? Is it the water salinity? Is it the refrigeration or anything like that? What's the big challenge?
It's mainly the managing the farms, the salinity on the farms, making sure that we're handling the oysters in the correct amount of time to keep the consistency and size and shape.
It's got to be hard. I remember talking to another oyster guy saying it's hot. You're in hip boots, you're in waders, you're out there standing in the water on a blazing hot day. On the opposite side, you're still in hip boots and waders on a freezing cold day, but you still got to be out there. It sounds like backbreaking work.
There's a lot of labor involved in it. Yes, it's hot and cold. You have to deal with the weather, and we're trying to, give the guys the right equipment to manage larger volumes of oysters and be consistent with them. So that's the challenge. How do we scale the operation to be consistent? And it just takes time to get that infrastructure and those processes in place.
What do you think you're going to be able to produce in maximum production? I know you've invested heavily into getting where you are today, and now you can take a cajillion customers reasonably. I'm exaggerating a bit, but when you're firing on all cylinders, what do you expect production to be? And you've got all the customers out there that are keeping you busy. What is production going to be?
It's going to be in the millions annually. And
millions of oysters annually.
Annually, yes.
Yeah. And with South Alabama, the headquarters of all that.
Correct.
Yeah. How many oysters do you have to start with to get a million? What is their attrition rate? That's not the right word, but what is the attrition of an oyster?
It varies from season to season. Sometimes it's over 50% mortality.
Yeah.
So those make challenging, times. The springtime we typically see some die-off or mortality. In the summer months, we're starting to see some. So there's different handling techniques, different types of equipment to handle the oysters gentler as the water's warm during the summer months. So figuring all that out, when do you not handle them too rough? When can you handle them more as the water temperature cools down and changes from season to season?
Do you have a calendar that you work off of, or is it hey, let's check the weather today and see what we need to do to react to today's weather? Or you're looking 3 days into the calendar to react to what the weather's bringing you?
It's not so much the day-to-day weather as it's the temperature, the salinity, the conditions. When are the waters starting to cool down? When do we see that if we do this grading process, we're not harming the oysters, and we need to go back and check to see that is there any mortality? Did we, what we did this week or 2 weeks ago, the oyster's still growing well. So it's a follow-up process.
Do you get a little sad as you send these little babies away?
No, we're happy. We're happy when we're shipping them. The objective is to grow them and sell them, and not to.
You don't name them like a pet.
You don't name them.
All right. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Doug Ankersen is the president of Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. Troy Rosser is his director of sales. We'll be right back.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit, with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. Doug Ankersen is sitting in front of me. He's a mechanical engineer by training. Today, he's the president of the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. Troy Rosser is a jack of all trades. Today has landed as the director of sales for the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. Both these gentlemen have a strategy for spreading the word on these fantastic products. I am a disciple of theirs, having had some of these oysters a number of times. I can promise you they're worth the effort to get them. Doug, throughout our neck of the woods down here, now we have listeners certainly in the Mobile area, but in spots all over the country. But as we talk about the oysters in our neck of the woods, Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, Grand Bay, all the different areas, there are different flavor profiles created based on the location of the oyster farms. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
So we'll talk about yours in a minute, but if we were to get in a boat and let's say go 5 miles east from where your farm is, is it possible for you to say, based on that distance, the profile of that oyster is going to be this versus ours?
Correct.
Yeah. What will it be? Can you give me a sense of what for the locals, what does a Fort Morgan oyster taste like compared to a Dauphin Island oyster?
A Fort Morgan oyster might have a little more salt content in it, but the flavor profile of the Dauphin Island oyster is a good medium salt, clean, crisp taste.
Yeah.
So maybe a little more minerality in the oyster, depending on where, if it's closer to, the Grand Bay, Savannah Park over there.
Yeah.
Where the water comes out of these tributaries and mixes with the brackish water. So there's a little more minerality with the oysters that are near the the Grand Bay, Sandy Bay area versus the ones at Dauphin Island might be a little saltier, and have a little bit different flavor profile.
I've been to restaurants where they offer a tray of oysters. Let's just say it's a dozen oysters from 6 different nurseries, and I'm talking about in Charleston or in Savannah, and they go up the East Coast all the way into Nova Scotia.
Correct.
And they try to describe the differences in those oysters. If I understand you correctly, you could do something similar here.
Yes.
Have a variety of oysters, each with a different flavor profile, all within a 15-mile circumference of each other.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
How far do you go into the saltwater, let's say the Gulf of Mexico, before an oyster is simply incapable of growing? I know you're near the shore, but can you grow an oyster in 20 feet of water, 30 feet of water?
You can't grow an oyster in the Gulf of Mexico because there's not enough nutrients and algae food for the oysters. The oysters have to survive or grow in the brackish waters, where the estuary system, where the salty Gulf water mixes with the river fresh water flowing into the estuary.
And is that the same as I go up the East Coast and get into the East Coast oysters? All those not profiles, but all those environments will be the same. There's going to be a discharge of fresh water. It's all going to be a brackish environment as you go up the East Coast.
Correct.
Even into the Maritimes, the Canadian islands.
Yeah. Now up the East Coast, they don't. The water is actually saltier. You can get to the point where the oysters are actually too salty, and they don't have the flavor, the flavor profile that our oysters have. And
yeah.
The unique flavor profile, when you look at the Mobile watershed, the Alabama watershed, it all drains into Mobile Bay, into Mississippi Sound, and that creates the flavor profile. We have tremendous amount of nutrients and natural flavor that comes from our freshwater system as it drains into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
Mobile Bay historically has produced millions and billions of oysters, over the last 150 to 200 years.
Yeah.
All of downtown, all of O'Shell Road, Bayfront Road. Historically, we have produced, unfathomable amounts of oysters and oyster shells.
Yeah, and even Old Shell Road was named after the fact that the shells were used, and then the oysters were consumed, and then the shells used to create the road.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then there's the local lore of Massacre Island down there on Dauphin, which is today Dauphin Island, and the oyster mounds that go back, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of years. How old are those things?
Probably thousands of years.
Yeah, the natives were shucking them and eating them there. How old, we're a little bit off topic, but how old is growing oysters versus harvesting naturally occurring oyster beds?
Oyster aquaculture was actually invented by a Roman engineer back, was it 95 BC?
No kidding, that old?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm looking at this document that you passed to me, 95 BC. This guy was growing oysters that long ago.
Yeah, he was a Roman engineer. He invented oyster aquaculture. He learned how to get the oyster larvae to attach to sticks and twigs, put them in shallow water, allow them to grow to a larger size, and then transfer them out into deeper water. Similar to what we're doing with the hatchery and the farms. We move them through different stages as they grow, and finally they get big enough to go out on the farm, where they grow out to what we're able to harvest every week, for our customers.
Right. Troy, when you're working with the locals here, not a right term, but how do we help spread the news? I'm a big advocate, as I know you know, of what we got going on with the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company.
Well, when you go in restaurants, if you're obviously you're looking for an oyster, ask them if they have Isle Dauphine oyster.
Call them by name.
Call it by name. And, if you're interested in getting oysters, not from a restaurant directly, go to isledauphine.oyster.com.
So you will sell to the end user or to the consumer, direct to consumer.
Correct.
Yeah, and you can order that on the website?
Correct.
isledauphine.oyster.com. That's good. So in your hope of hopes, in your dream of dreams, Doug, you got into this, and I would suspect that you never thought you'd end up here. It's kind of grown up around you because if I recall correctly, you first sold oyster equipment and then got into doing it yourself.
Correct.
Yeah. In your dream of dreams, what would happen as you're trying to spread the name of primarily your oyster company, Isle Dauphine Oysters, but as well as oysters grown in our neck of the woods? What's the ultimate, what would be the best thing that could happen?
That it becomes a product that's used locally. It's recognized regionally in this area, and that we celebrate, this type of oyster. We celebrate the fact that the oysters clean the waters up, create habitat for other marine species, and it's a world-class product. It's a premium product that competes. When I was the equipment supplier, I traveled up to Atlantic Canada, traveled the Northeast and the West Coast to see how these other, off-bottom oyster farming operations worked. And my hope is to have that industry, be a substantial industry here in the local, Mobile area.
What about you? Dream of dreams.
I think exactly what Doug said, and to see these oysters, and as options for customers and all the local restaurants that serve oysters.
Yeah.
And to see the support locally, and people take pride in what's been harvested here, and the work that's been done here to produce these things.
You don't want to have somebody from Mobile, Alabama have to go to Nashville to get one of the local oysters in a restaurant.
Bingo.
Or Atlanta, God forbid Atlanta. Once it crosses the city limits of Atlanta, it can't taste as good. There's nothing good that happens in Atlanta. Or New Orleans, which I do appreciate, the New Orleans. We have the good stuff here. Let's celebrate what we have. I like the way you said it, Doug. Let's celebrate what we have. Isle Dauphine Oysters, folks. IsleDauphineOysters.com. You can order them direct. You can pick them up in Theodore, I think, if that's correct.
Correct, yes.
And they'll ship them to you. Will you ship them to them? If my favorite listener in Mitchell, South Dakota wants them shipped to Mitchell, you can get them to Mitchell.
We can get them to Mitchell, yes.
Happy to do it. Folks, you're listening to What's Working. Doug Ankersen, Troy Rosser, Isle Dauphine Oyster Company. We'll be back after this break with final comments.
I'm Joey Mason. For 4 years, my goal has been to produce the best farm-to-table products I'd ever eaten. I've done just that at our on-site USDA facility in Grand Bay, Alabama, allowing us to ship directly to your door. This is true farm-to-table. Visit us at masonhillsfarm.com to see all that we have to offer.
I don't know a whole lot about oyster farming. I've fished the farms a number of times, casting lures and baits in between these baskets to try to pull out a trout or a redfish. And I've been around them, but I've never done it. But I've been around these things while they're being worked on, tended, maintained, all that kind of stuff. It's hard work. And Doug is, he mentioned that it is labor intensive, and I would reframe that to say that it's very hard work. And I've learned from some of these oyster guys, it's hard to find the labor that will become predictable to do the work, because they think it sounds fun, and then they get out there in the water and the sun and the heat and the cold, and they're like, whoa, this is a little bit more than I thought it would be. The point being, when you get some of these farm-raised oysters, at least from the Gulf Coast, this is the one that I know about, what you're tasting here is something that has not been left to chance, something that has been very carefully stewarded by the people that are hatching and breeding these oysters, as well as growing them, measuring the coolness and the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water, to make sure that the product that you get is as good as it can be. and the terroir, I think is the word, of the different areas changes the flavor profile. And it was at a oyster event here in Mobile, Alabama, where there were maybe, let's say, half a dozen oyster companies, and each one of them tasted distinctly different, all grown within a 15-mile radius of one another, a 15-mile area of one another, based on the salinity and the temperature of the water. It's really pretty cool. And the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company is the one that, of the many that are around here, maybe 15, the flavor profile of that one, when I went down that line of the oysters at this oyster event, jumped out at me. They're all good, folks. I'm not trying to belittle any of them, but they're all good. But that one leapt out at me, and it was Doug that I cornered and said, hey, tell me more about what you got going on here. This is pretty cool. There's a part of it that's, frankly, heartening to me, that a mechanical engineer with that training, I've always been a fan of engineers, but that training and the precision that goes into becoming and practicing mechanical engineering, that this guy is now practicing it on the oysters that he grows. It's fantastic. Anyway, that'll wrap us for this week, everybody. You can find the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company info on the podcast page for this broadcast. Go to what'sworkingcam.com, look for the Isle Dauphine Oyster Company show, and as you go through the notes, you'll find links to their website where you can order them for wherever you are in the country. They can ship them to you there, and if you're local, you can swing by their place in Theodore and pick them up in a box ready for you, in a bag rather, ready for you. I've done it once before. Well worth the effort. You're listening to What's Working. You can find us on social media. Go find What's Working Cam. And we're sending out weekly emails of what I call the coolest thing in the world this week. Stuff that I've seen and learned that I think will be helpful to you. If you want to get into those emails, go to cammarston.com and you can sign up. You'll get a free chapter of my book, and you will go on the list for receiving the emails. Again, cammarston.com, the coolest thing in the world this week. Sign up at that website. We'll have another show next week. Have a good week, everybody. As you likely know, this show originates as a radio show broadcast across the state of Alabama, and it continues to grow in both radio listeners and market. After it's formatted for radio, we then turn it into this podcast. Please share it with those you think would find it interesting, and subscribe to the podcast on my YouTube page, where you can leave messages and your thoughts and your comments, and I'll certainly get back in touch. Finally, if you're a fan of the show, please offer a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can find my book called What Works on Amazon.com. In it, I highlight the top 10 ideas from the first 200 episodes of the show. Mind you, they're not the top 10 best episodes, they're the top 10 best ideas. Many times the same ideas are brought up again and again by different guests, and we dig into those ideas in such a way that they'll be easily applicable for your business. Simply go to Amazon and enter my name, and you'll find What Works as well as my other books. Chapter titles include How to Find a Niche, Innovation, Building Teams, and so forth. To learn more about the workshops and seminars I offer, go to cammarston.com. There you can view clips of my work, view workshop titles, view my reviews, case studies, customer lists. It's all there. If you'd like a free copy of one of the chapters of my book, enter your email address at the bottom of the homepage at cammarston.com. And from that site, you can email me directly. I always love to hear from you. You'll also find me on social media. Find Cam Marston on all the social media platforms, and you may need to enter the numeral 1. There's one other Cam Marston out there, and that numeral 1 distinguishes me from him from time to time. So if you're unsure if it's me or not, enter that numeral 1 after my name, and it should do the trick. On a more personal and less professional side, I record weekly commentaries that air across Alabama on Alabama Public Radio twice each day on Fridays, called Keeping It Real. They've won statewide and national awards. They're simple observations on the world as it goes on around me, and they're only a few minutes long. They're a passion. You can find them on the same podcast app you're using to listen to this. Finally, if you're interested in advertising on this podcast or the radio show, reach out. I've worked hard to cultivate a specific listener, and I can tell you all about them, and I have many different options for helping you reach them. Thanks again for listening. We'll have another episode available soon.